Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the news of Drew being shot did not just ripple through Port Charles, it exploded like a bomb, splintering the community's sense of safety and unraveling the carefully maintained threads of normalcy. Every corner of town seemed to buzz with disbelief, outrage, and whispered speculation, as though the very air carried the weight of the tragedy. Drew had always been a polarizing figure, respected by some, resented by others, yet no one could have predicted the brutal scene that awaited Tracy when she entered his home. What should have been a quiet, familiar refuge was transformed into a tableau of horror. Drew sprawled helplessly on the floor, his body soaked in his own blood. The silence of the house broken only by the frantic sound of Tracy's voice as she called for help. The shock of that discovery became the spark for a frenzy of gossip and fear, especially when law enforcement refused to release immediate details. Their silence, whether strategic or uncertain, only deepened the paranoia that gripped the town. Was this a deliberate assassination carried out with surgical precision, or was it a reckless act born of chaos spiraling out of control? The unanswered question spread like wildfire, and as hours passed with no clarity, the people closest to Drew were consumed by dread. Trust began to erode as suspicion spread, each person silently wondering if betrayal had been festering closer to home than they dared to admit. For Willow, the devastating news was more than just another tragedy in Port Charles, it was the collapse of her entire world. To her, Drew was not merely a man she admired or desired. He had become the embodiment of possibility, a symbol of hope in her otherwise suffocating life. She had bound her future to him in ways she could hardly articulate, convincing herself that he alone could unlock the one thing she craved above all else, the return of her children. Michael's grip over Wiley and Amelia had always felt unshakable, reinforced by power, wealth, and influence, but in Drew, Willow saw a chance to break those chains. He was her lifeline, her anchor, and the vessel through which she could reclaim what was rightfully hers. That blind devotion, that desperate faith, had blinded her to the precarious imbalance of their relationship. It was not a love grounded in equality or trust, but a dependence that consumed her completely. When she learned of Drew's shooting, when the words filtered into her consciousness like shards of glass, her mind and body gave way to the weight of it all. She collapsed in the sterile corridors of the hospital, her consciousness swallowed by the enormity of her fear. When she awoke, the sterile scent of disinfectant and the harsh glow of fluorescent lights surrounded her, and reality pressed in with suffocating force. If Drew slipped away into death, she would lose not only the man she had clung to but also the fragile dream of regaining her children. The devastation was total, leaving her hollowed out, as though every purpose she had built her fragile existence upon was vanishing into nothingness. Meanwhile, Drew's condition teetered precariously between life and death. The bullets had torn into him with merciless precision, embedding themselves near his spine and threatening both his survival and any semblance of recovery. The operating room became a stage for desperation, where surgeons fought to push back against the inevitability of loss. Their every move weighed down by the knowledge that a single misstep could spell the end. To those outside, it seemed as though fate itself had turned against Drew, stripping away every chance he had to rebuild his fractured life. And yet, within the haze of pain and slipping consciousness, Drew clung to one final clarity. It was as if the approach of death sharpened his mind, focusing his will into a singular act. He made a choice not for himself, but for Willow. In those final moments of lucidity, he entrusted her with his most dangerous possession, the secrets he had carried in silence for far too long. These were not whispers or idle speculations but hard truths, gathered meticulously and hidden away. Truths that had the power to shatter reputations, dismantle Michael's carefully constructed facade, and tip the balance of power once and for all. They were fragments of corruption, distorted truths wrapped in polished lies, and betrayals that ran deeper than anyone dared to imagine. Drew's gift was both salvation and curse, a heavy legacy meant to outlive him. When Willow received the evidence, it felt as though the universe had shifted in her hands. The documents, recordings, and coded notes were not merely scraps of information, they were weapons, sharpened with the capacity to wound, expose, and destroy. Holding them, Willow felt a surge of power she had never known, a sensation that both thrilled and terrified her. It was as if she had been handed a gleaming blade, one sharp enough to cut through the web Michael had spun around her children. And yet, in that same moment, the lines of her intentions blurred. The obsession she had cultivated around Drew did not dissipate with his impending death. It only grew stronger, binding her to him in ways that confused even her own heart. She could not separate her longing for her children from her desperate need to hold onto Drew's memory, to cling to the man who had given her both hope and ruin. Was she fighting for her children out of maternal devotion, or was she simply clinging to the fragments of a man she could not bear to lose? The questions tore at her, leaving her vulnerable and unsteady, even as those around her watched her descent with mounting concern. Friends whispered about her fragile state. Colleagues noted the reckless edge in her behavior, yet none could dissuade her. Willow had chosen her path, and it was a path carved in shadows and lined with peril. For her, there was no retreat, no compromise. In her eyes, there existed only one course: to wield the secrets Drew had left behind as a weapon, to transform his dark legacy into her salvation, and to strike against Michael with every ounce of strength and cunning she could muster. It was not a choice born of clarity or wisdom, but of desperation and grief, and it propelled her into dangerous territory she did not fully understand. Every step she took toward using those secrets brought her closer not only to victory but also to annihilation, for Drew's gift was double-edged. It could grant her the justice and reunion she craved, but it could just as easily consume her, dragging her into the same abyss of betrayal and destruction that had claimed Drew himself. Willow stood at the precipice, clutching the weapon of truth, yet blind to the shadows gathering around her. On the other side of this unfolding storm, Michael remained utterly unaware that a catastrophe was silently brewing around him. To the outside world, he continued to present the image of a devoted father, splitting his energy between maintaining stability for Wiley and Amelia and ensuring that Willow remained at arm's length from the children. His protective instincts grew sharper each day, especially as Wiley, perceptive beyond his years, continued to ask questions about his mother and about Drew. Each mention of Drew's name unsettled Michael, striking him with the uneasy knowledge that ghosts from Willow's choices still haunted his household. He understood that any lapse in judgment, any misstep in handling Willow, could unravel the fragile control he held over his family. Yet, what he could not anticipate was that Willow was no longer the desperate, pleading woman he had dismissed. She was now the keeper of a weapon that Drew had deliberately placed in her hands. That weapon was not forged in steel or fire but in truth, corruption, and betrayal. The cache of evidence Drew left behind was far more than a simple folder of incriminating papers. It was a vast, meticulously curated archive capable of dismantling Michael's carefully maintained facade. Hidden among Drew's files were records of financial entanglements that revealed a tangled web of questionable dealings, secret payments that had been rerouted through shell accounts, and legal maneuvers cloaked in the guise of legitimacy. There were contracts signed under shadowy circumstances, conversations discreetly recorded, and testimonies from individuals who had once been loyal but were now forever compromised. It was a trove of devastation, and Drew had understood its value all too well. If made public, the documents would not merely tarnish Michael's reputation, they would obliterate it, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. The imminent death of Drew, therefore, was more than just a personal tragedy for those who cared about him. It was the catalyst for a larger storm that threatened to engulf everyone in its path. The question of who had fired the fatal shots remained unanswered, a haunting mystery that unsettled every conversation in town. Yet beneath that unanswered question, one certainty loomed large: Drew had not departed quietly. With deliberate intention, he had planted the seeds of a war that would outlast him, a conflict destined to draw Willow, Michael, and countless others into its orbit. His final act was not of surrender but of defiance, ensuring that the secrets he had guarded would ignite chaos long after his heartbeat ceased. At the center of this looming storm stood Willow, driven by a dangerous mix of grief, obsession, and unyielding maternal longing. The love she had clung to for Drew had already blurred her reason, but now, armed with the knowledge he entrusted to her, she had become the axis upon which the entire battle would turn. The evidence was both her salvation and her curse. It gave her the means to challenge Michael, to rip away the carefully polished mask he wore before the world, and to reclaim her children. Yet at the same time, it placed her squarely in the crosshairs of forces she could not yet comprehend. She was no longer simply a grieving mother or a desperate lover. She had become the custodian of truths so volatile that they could topple families, destroy alliances, and set Port Charles ablaze with scandal. Drew had not underestimated the gravity of what he handed her. In his final moments of clarity, he chose Willow not because she was the most cunning or the most powerful, but because she was the one person with enough passion, enough desperation, to wield the secrets with absolute conviction. He knew that greed or ambition might falter, but a mother's fight for her children would never yield. To Drew, Willow was not merely a companion, she was the inheritor of his unfinished war, the only one who could ensure that the truths he had uncovered would not die with him. Whether she realized it or not, his gift was a double-edged sword, a legacy of shadows that would either secure her future or consume her entirely. Michael, blind to this reality, continued to move through his days with an uneasy calm, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crack. The fortress he had built around his family was about to be tested by forces he could not control. And the most dangerous threat of all was not a stranger from the outside but the woman he once believed he had defeated. Willow, armed with Drew's secrets, had stepped into a game where every move was perilous, and where victory and destruction were indistinguishably intertwined. Among the files Drew had concealed, Willow uncovered a chilling chain of clandestine financial transactions that painted an entirely different picture of Michael than the one the world believed. On the surface, Michael projected the image of a man devoted to his children, upstanding in his role as a father and citizen of Port Charles. But beneath that veneer was a darker reality, one meticulously recorded in Drew's cache of documents. The records showed a pattern of discrete payments funneled through offshore accounts and layered through shell corporations, all designed to obscure their origin. These transactions were not merely abstract numbers, they were strategically tied to specific legal cases, evidence that Michael had leveraged both wealth and influence to bend outcomes in his favor. The implications were devastating. If these documents were exposed, they would reveal that the custody rights Michael had so confidently wielded over Wiley and Amelia were tainted from the very start. His victories in court, which had once seemed like the result of credibility and paternal stability, would unravel as fraud built on corruption, opening the door for everything to be challenged, perhaps even reversed entirely. Yet the financial records were only the beginning. Drew had also left behind an audio recording, Ryan damning, in which one of Michael's closest confidants and allies so trusted that their loyalty had never before been questioned was caught in a moment of careless honesty. On the tape, the voice admitted to accepting bribes to safeguard Michael's image, ensuring that damaging truths were buried and that Michael's reputation remained untarnished before both the courts and the public. The recording was short but potent, a piece of evidence so explosive that it could ignite a scandal powerful enough to topple Michael not just as a father, but as a man of standing in Port Charles. In a town where legal circles, financial networks, and social hierarchies were tightly interwoven. The release of such a recording would not simply tarnish Michael, it would reverberate through every alliance and institution that had once supported him. For Willow, listening to that recording was like standing at the edge of a precipice. Her hands trembled, her pulse raced, and her chest constricted with the realization that she now held the key to unseating Michael completely. It was the proof she had always longed for, the weapon that could finally cut through the wall he had built between her and her children. Yet along with empowerment came terror. She understood instinctively that possession of this evidence made her dangerous in the eyes of anyone tied to Michael's empire, whether allies desperate to protect him or enemies eager to seize control for themselves. The moment she pressed play on that recording, she had marked herself. With this knowledge, she was no longer invisible, she was a threat, and threats in Port Charles did not go unchallenged. The woman who had once been a gentle nurse, someone who had softened her voice to soothe patients and had stood meekly beside Michael in the past, was gone. The grief of losing Drew, the crushing weight of betrayal, and the raw hunger to reclaim her children had reshaped her into someone else entirely. She was harder now, her innocence burned away by pain and necessity. What stood in her place was a woman who was prepared to enter a ruthless power struggle she had never imagined herself part of. Though inexperienced in such games, her desperation lent her a fierceness she had never possessed before. She began to envision scenarios where she could wield these documents and recordings not merely as evidence, but as leverage, a way to force Michael to retreat, to bend him into conceding, to prove before the courts and the community that he was unfit to hold the role of father. And yet, amid her resolve, the shadow of Drew lingered. His presence clung to every page she turned, every line of ledger she read, every second of that damning recording she replayed in her mind. She questioned his intentions even as she prepared to act. Did Drew give her these secrets out of faith in her strength, believing she alone had the drive to see his work finished? Or had he, in his final act, used her grief as a vessel, passing the burden of his unfinished war onto her shoulders because he knew she would have no choice but to carry it forward? The ambiguity haunted her, twisting her thoughts into knots. She could not know if she was honoring his trust or being manipulated into fighting a battle he could not win himself. Either way, Willow understood one truth with absolute clarity. The moment she decided to unleash what Drew had left behind, there would be no return. These were not simple revelations that could be brushed aside. They were weapons of destruction, capable of dismantling Michael's world and setting Port Charles ablaze with scandal. But with every weapon comes risk, and Willow now stood in the dangerous position of both wielder and target. Uncertain if she would emerge victorious or be consumed by the very secrets she had been entrusted to hold. The arrival of Drew's documents had not only unsettled Willow's life but had also cracked open fissures beneath the surface of Port Charles, threatening to destabilize the entire foundation of influence and power in the city. At first, Willow could not fully comprehend the danger contained within the Fulasse, saw them only as a weapon, a key that could pry her children out of Michael's grasp. But the more she examined them, the more she understood their reach. They were not mere accusations, not flimsy pieces of gossip, but meticulously gathered proof that implicated Michael in a web of deceit so vast that it touched judges, attorneys, financiers, and figures of prominence who had long seemed untouchable. Each document, each recording, each ledger entry was a thread, and when pulled, it threatened to unravel a tapestry of corruption that extended far beyond Michael himself. The implications terrified her as much as they emboldened her. Willow began to realize that she was no longer fighting a private custody battle. She was stepping into a dangerous arena where every revelation carried political weight, financial ruin, and the potential to expose people who would stop at nothing to preserve their reputations. Those who had once clasped Michael's hand in partnership now faced a harrowing dilemma. They could abandon him, allowing him to fall in order to shield themselves, or they could unite against Willow, extinguishing the threat before it reached daylight. In a world where self-preservation reigned supreme, the second option seemed far more likely. She was not just holding evidence, she was holding a death sentence with her own name written on it. The change in Willow became visible almost immediately. The gentle nurse who once embodied compassion and tenderness seemed to vanish. Chase, ever observant, saw the unease in her gaze, a restless flicker that betrayed the storms brewing beneath her calm exterior. Liz noticed it too. The way Willow spoke with an intensity that bordered on obsession, the slight tremors in her hands when she believed no one was watching, the sharpness in her words when Michael's name was mentioned. What unsettled them most was the aura of isolation she carried. Willow, who had once leaned on others for strength, now recoiled from their concern, her eyes hardening as if she alone bore the weight of a mission no one else could understand. Willow told herself she could not turn back, not after Drew's death had left her with this inheritance of fire. She believed she had been chosen, that Drew had entrusted her not out of convenience but out of recognition that she had the will to finish what he had started. It was a belief that gave her strength, but also blinded her to the danger closing in. At night, as she pored over the files in secret, she felt Drew's presence pressing against her thoughts. Sometimes she imagined his voice, nudging her forward, whispering that she was his last chance to make the truth known. Other times she wondered if he had seen her grief as a weakness, a lever he could use to ensure that someone, anyone, would carry his unfinished war into the future. That uncertainty gnawed at her, twisting her conviction into both devotion and doubt. As she immersed herself deeper, she began to notice subtle shifts in her surroundings, things that she was no longer moving and seen. Once, as she left the hospital late at night, she felt the weight of ice following her, though when she turned, the street appeared empty. Another time, she returned to her apartment to find the latch on her window slightly askew, a detail so minor it could have been overlooked, yet chilling in its implication. Someone had been inside. The realization sent a cold rush through her veins. Whoever it was had not taken anything, but the message was clear. She was being watched. Her possession of the documents was no longer a secret. This only solidified her resolve. Willow began hiding the files in multiple locations, never trusting a single place to keep them safe. She tucked portions away in a locked compartment at the hospital, concealed others within books in her apartment, and even slipped a few into an old safety deposit box registered under a name no one connected to her. Each step into paranoia tightened her grip on the mission, even as it frayed her mind. She began drafting scenarios, imagining courtrooms where Michael's lies were exposed, and plotting confrontations where he would be forced to kneel beneath the weight of his own corruption. Yet with every plan she made, the shadow of danger loomed closer. She could not deny that enemies were circling, waiting for the moment she revealed her hand. The question that haunted her grew louder with each day. If she exposed the secrets, what would be the cost? It would not only tear Michael down but also unleash destruction across Port Charles, implicating figures of power whose wrath could swallow her whole. Could she withstand the weight of their retaliation, the collapse of an entire system bearing down upon her shoulders? Or would she, like Drew, be crushed beneath the enormity of the truth she carried? The possibility lingered like a poison in her mind that she was not a strategist controlling the board, but a pawn placed deliberately into motion, doomed to be sacrificed in a game that had been set in motion long before she even realized she was playing. And yet, even knowing this, Willow pressed forward. She was no longer the woman she had once been. Grief had stripped her of softness, leaving behind a figure forged in desperation and shadow. To her, there was no choice left but to act. Drew's secrets were both her salvation and her curse, and as she clutched them tighter, she stepped willingly into a darkness that promised either victory or obliteration.